so thanks for coming along. So we talk about miracles today. This was a new topic for me, and when Andrew said, well, we'll do a selection of topics, and there's only one date I could do, and he said, oh, well, the topic that day is miracles. Okay, well, we'll give that one a crack. It's not popular in thin air. A lot of you might know me as the CEO of the Warehouse, but in parallel with that, I've got a theology degree. I'm a qualified Baptist pastor. And I'm now about 80% through a master's in apologetics through Powell University in the States. I'm a generalist in that area, really. I'm not a PhD in biochemistry or physics or maths, so I'm a generalist. And I think that's good, because I think often this can be intimidatory. And as a generalist, I think what I'd encourage is that anyone can get their head around most of the concepts. There is stuff that's tough, but there's good quality literature out there that if you apply yourself, you can pick a topic and get stuck into it and make sense of it. So that's what I did with miracles. I basically said, okay, I'll go with that, and then I did some research, some good research. There's not a huge amount on miracles, because it's a fairly black or white, simple discussion, actually, which I'll come to in a minute. And so there isn't a lot of literature actually on miracles compared to, say, evolution or other areas of apologetics, the case of the resurrection, and many other areas. And so I'll give it a crack. We'll ask questions, and we'll see whether I've done any good. So what is a miracle? What I'm going to cover off is what is a miracle, firstly. Then I'm going to talk about ontology and epistemology. And already, if some of you are going, oh my gosh, that's gone over my head. Don't be intimidated by big words. You just got to get a dictionary. They're wonderful things. You can go through them and learn what a word means. And I mean that. We can be intimidated by big words. And most words are understandable. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by ontology and epistemology. And everything in this whole area, actually, in all areas of why we believe what we believe, is actually about ontology and epistemology. So it's worth getting your head around what those words are about. I'll talk about the case against miracles, and particularly him. Many people you might meet who've had a little bit of philosophy or first year university work will often say, oh, Hume proved miracles are impossible. So I'll touch on that. Then I'll talk about the case for miracles. Two different cases. One called the top-down case, which is really, there's a strong case for God. So if God exists, miracles are pretty easy to happen, actually. That's the basic thesis there. And then the bottom-up case, which is a case from, if miracles have happened, then there's good evidence for miracles. How do you assess that? And then just wrap up at the end. Okay, so what is a miracle? Really, there's two types of things when we use the general word miracle. There's sort of highly improbable events. For those who are believers, you might sometimes call them God coincidences. Where you go, look, how did that happen? That's a bit weird. Highly improbable events, answered prayer, survival in certain situations of people who've prayed, prophecy, the prophetic, healing, the very existence of Israel in 1948, 2,000 years after this nation was scattered, in AD 70, after the destruction of the temple. The fact that this people held together and came together, you could say, is miraculous in that sense. And I'm sure many of you here could relate many things you would call miracles in your life that were just highly improbable and hard just to explain. My wife, for example, about 14 years ago, had a vision of me speaking about my faith, and that would have seemed ridiculous to people at that time that I would have faith. I was not a Christian at all, and yet she had a very clear prophetic picture of that. When I served as an associate pastor at Powell Baptist Church, we would encourage the church to send through any prophetic words they've had. And often, Powell is not as big as Windsor Park, but it's a really large Baptist church. You get things coming from different parts of the church where people could never know each other. That we're just thinking, how on earth could this be happening? How could they say those words? How could And we can ascribe them to miracles. Many would just say, oh, well, they're just coincidences. And you're looking for it. And let's be fair, there are charlatans out there. Charlatans who can, perform, draw things out from you, and that. So, but there are highly improbable events. The other is impossible events, what we call where the natural laws of the universe and the world are broken. There's an inbreaking of something, what we call supernatural, because I prefer the word supernatural. It's sort of suspended the laws of nature. Some healings could be looked at like that. Water into wine. Jesus turning water into wine. Walking on water. And perhaps the most famous, the resurrection. Dead bodies don't come alive again. In natural terms. And so, two types of miracles. I'll touch on both of those. And usually when there's a atheistic critique of miracles, it's usually a critique of the second type. To say that they are impossible and they can't be true. The first type are usually just dismissed as wishful thinking or mistakenness or just coincidence. That's usually the argument against the first type overall. So in terms of those difficult words, ontology and epistemology, let's just talk what I mean there. Ontology is the academic discipline of studying what's real. What is really real in the universe? The metaphysics is what's real. Is all that exists matter and energy? And the naturalist, the physicalist, the materialist, those words all say, as a worldview that says all that exists is matter and energy and time. There's nothing else. All this soul stuff, chemicals, guys, God projections. Souls, the thought of spirits, anything like that, God, anything that's immaterial does not exist. They're just, and in fact, a radical naturalist, materialist, would even say any sense that you have free will is made up. It's just chemicals. It's just physical matter and acting on each other over time that causes things to happen. Everything's determined. You don't really have free will to make free choice. It's just chemicals. The fact I just decided to put my arm up there was not my free will. It was just chemicals that happened in reaction to different things. Now, intuitively, that's nonsense. But I'm just saying what an extreme physicalist, naturalist worldview would be. There's no soul, there's no immaterial. That's a claim about reality. That's a claim of metaphysics. Ontology studies that. And epistemology is the study, this academic discipline of saying, how do we know things? How can we know things? So, again, a radical naturalist, materialist, physicalist, I'm using these words all together. There's probably some very fine differences that somebody could make between them. But they all come from a point of view that all exists in matter and energy. And the epistemology of those type of people often would be, and we can only know stuff through the application of scientific method, the empirical scientific method, and the application of rational logic as well together. Usually they'll take the two together. You can't have radical empiricists who just say all we can know is through the scientific method, and even rational logic should not be applied, but it gets a bit odd, I think that does. But these two things are really important when we come to miracles, because often the arguments rule things out right from the beginning. Because if all we are is matter and energy, and we can only know stuff through application of a scientific method, well, there's no miracles. They just cannot exist. They're ruled out a priori, is the technical term. They're ruled out before you start. You're just talking past each other. And if that lands you, we'll come back to this, hopefully reinforce it. But it's a really important point in the sense that, a modernist, materialist, physicalist, naturalist, philosophical naturalism, by definition, rules out the possibility of miracles. It rules out the possibility that Jesus could have been resurrected. It rules out the possibility of God. And so you're just talking past each other. So Richard Dawkins is a radical materialist. So actually, you're almost pointless talking to each other. What he considers to be the nature of reality rules out anything. And so when things are being investigated, if anyone's saying, could there be any evidence of a designing mind at work in the universe, it's ruled out. So you're always going to look for a natural solution, overall. So, actually though, in reality, there are a number of ways we can approach knowing stuff, epistemology. There's deduction and there's empirical induction. Deduction is applying logical reasoning. All cats are black, Fifi is a cat, Fifi is black. Two propositions and you come up with a conclusion. That's mathematics is a deductive method, often, that leads you to a conclusion. It's logical. You can't actually prove it by science or mathematics. It's just logical deduction. Induction is the scientific method. Well, if I'm not losing you, I'm getting some blank stares, but stick with me. Induction is saying, we've got all this sort of evidence, these facts. Can we apply a general law, a hypothesis that seems to be able to apply to this and predict things in the future? So you measure an apple falling all the time, the speed it drops, and you can apply a mathematical model of that, a hypothesis that can then be generalized to be used to predict for the future. That's what the scientific method does. It's called induction overall. Right? So largely, and this is not a science versus religion thing I'm setting up here at all. There's only one truth. What I'm sort of saying is, often the arguments against miracles come from a very natural, philosophical, naturalistic worldview. They come out of that and they exclude it. And you'll see that in a minute when I talk about Hume in a second. And they exclude it and there's nothing else to talk about really. They're just talking past each other overall. And they're applying largely deduction and induction to reach those conclusions overall. Again, in philosophy, there's logical positivism, which is a similar way that sort of applies, says that the only sentences that make sense, that can be true, are deductive logic and empirically verifiable statements. The fact is that even that statement can't be proved itself, it's self-defeating. Just want to, I'll leave that sit there and we'll come back to it. Methodological naturalism is a bit different to philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is saying all that can possibly exist is matter and energy and natural laws. That's all that exists. Methodological naturalism is slightly less bold. It just says there may be other things that exist, but the only thing that we can know is through the scientific method. That's all we can know. Everything else is just belief, it's just views. Stick with me. So, three main worldviews at play in the West at the moment. Philosophical naturalism, materialism, modernism, they're all the same largely. That says matter and energy is all there is. And all we can know is through application of scientific method and logical reasoning to that. That's all. Okay? There's another worldview that's the exact opposite. That's a very narrow view of reality and knowledge. If you think about the human condition, we'll come on to that. Another worldview, which is especially popular if you're doing literature or popular in the general population now, is the exact opposite, postmodernism, which actually says we can't know anything. All you've got is your personal point of view. That's it. All you've got is your story. And radical postmodernism would say there is no reality. My answer to that is go and sit on a motorway. And discover reality. Or a 10-ton truck. But postmodernism is very influential in the culture. Because it's saying you can't know anything. overall. It really came, and there's some good in every, in both these worldviews there's some real good. Methodological naturalism, applying the method of science, has led to us huge great understanding of the universe and the natural world. Hugely positive. Postmodernism has been good because it's challenged us to say, well, where are you biased? Where are you biased? Where are you got blind spots overall? So they both got some real good stuff in them overall. And then there's a theistic worldview. So three big worldviews apply: modernism, postmodernism, and then theism. And what theism says is, no, there is a broader, we can know reality, it's not postmodernism, there is reality and we can know it, but that reality is much broader than just matter and energy. That reality includes the non-material. There is a soul, there's much, much more. Theistic realism says that things like beauty, art, music, they're real. They're real things. Love is something real. There are abstract ideas. Mathematics, in many ways, does a number one really exist? We've got Georgia who's a mathematician. Does the number one really exist? I know it's an odd thing, but they're concepts, but they work. There's something going on here. There's sort of reality beyond just the material. That is very real. And theism, the belief in God, which is what Christianity is believes there's much more than just matter and energy. There's a soul. There's a mind. Your mind is different to your brain. That's a big argument in philosophy. Consciousness is real. You can't prove these things just with naturalism. And so there are, you take that third area, theistic realism says there is much more than matter and energy and we can know it. And when it's saying we can know it, it's saying, yes, the deduction, the application of reason is good, the inductive method is good to get at us understanding the natural world, but there is also abductive reasoning, a third type of reasoning. And that third type of reasoning, abductive reasoning, is what we apply in a court of law. It takes the evidence, all types of evidence from the past, etc., and it says what explains this evidence the most. What's got the most explanatory power, explanatory scope, is the most plausible, and the least ad hoc to explain this evidence. That's what a court of law does. It doesn't mean you need 100% certainty. People will be locked away for a long time on the basis of it being beyond reasonable doubt. You can believe it. It is reasonable to believe it. In fact, it's highly reasonable to believe it. So, three types of worldview about what's real and what we can know. Modernism, same words, naturalism, physicalism, etc. There's just matter and energy, and we can only know that through application of deduction and induction. Measure in particulars to take general rules. Postmodernism, we can't know anything, and everything's just subjective opinion, your opinion. Theistic realism, which says, actually, what's real is much more than just matter and energy and time. And we can know it in different ways overall. So, a lot to throw at you there, but go with it, because some of this will come out as we go through. So, reality and acknowledging truth. What is truth? Truth is when our beliefs correspond to reality. When they correspond. When they're in line with reality. With what we will believe is in line with the way things are. That's truth. Yeah? That's what we try and find out in a court of law. I used that example earlier. That's how we live, actually. When we come to try and work things out. What are our sources of what we come to think we know? Evidential sources. When we are evidential sources, they're things we take as facts. Again, take that court of law analogy. Facts may be presented. What are the types of sources that help us form our view of reality? And there's a number of them. Science is a source. Reason and logic So inductive application, deductive. History archaeology, by definition, past events can't be repeated. We're looking back in the past. So by definition, it's very hard to set up a scientific experiment by the classic scientific method to try and work out what happened. Because it's a past event that's just gone on, overall. So we have to piece together, we've got this pot, we've got this bit of literature, we've got this sort of stuff that's been written. What was going on back there 200, 300, 400 years ago? We apply that abductive reasoning. What hypothesis has the most explanatory scope, explanatory power, is the most plausible, that is, it's got the least things against it, and isn't just sort of ad hoc. What I mean by ad hoc is, well, aliens came and did it. Well, I can explain anything. It's not ad hoc in that sense. And then there's another source, which is sometimes dismissed, and that is personal experience and intuition. We all are human. We all have consciousness. There is a human condition and human experience. All of these sources can be interpreted erroneously. They can have error in them overall. But they're all sources of what helps us work out what we believe, what we take as knowledge. As Christians, and most of you in this room probably are, that's not all, we also see the Bible working with God's Spirit as a source of truth as well. In fact, as a Christian, as a conservative, Bible-believing Christian myself, I believe all these other sources, this is the norm and norm, have to be assessed against Scripture, because that's God's special revelation. I've got reasons from science, history, logic, personal intuition about why I believe that, why I believe the Bible is that source as well. So, that's our sources of knowledge overall. So you go on with me here. Stick with me. Often people will say, they'll act as if, when they get into an argument about could miracles happen, could Jesus have been risen from the dead, does God exist, they'll actually start taking it back to, well, if you can't believe it with 100% certainty, you can't believe it. Well, that's really a fairly stupid way to live. None of us live like that, overall. Most of us are willing to accept beliefs that fall in a sort of highly certain area. Taking history, archaeology, personal experience, science, logic, we're pretty happy to say, we're pretty certain about that. And if you get multiple sources of things that are reasonably certain, they sort of build on each other. There's a cumulative effect overall that comes together. But we have to accept that there's some things that can be 100%, virtually no doubt. Deductive reasoning works like that largely. There's some things that we can be highly certain. There's some things we can be quite uncertain about when we're assessing evidence overall. So I'm laying up the groundwork here for a few things. So when we look at causes of things in this universe, right, there's three types of causes. The first is natural causes. That's what science is really good at finding. The scientific method is great at finding natural causes. That natural causes are where matter and energy and time are acting on each other in events to cause things to happen. Bumping into each other. Molecules are bumping into each other all the time. In the world as well, we recognize there's agent causes, personal causes, where a free agent, i.e. you, causes things to happen. You press a button, somebody gets stabbed. There's an agent cause going on. And then we also recognize a final cause, an end cause, which was why the agent did something. Motivation in a crime, for example. Often and again in a court of law, was there a motive? There's evidence that an agent did something, that it wasn't just a wind that blew through this room, mangled the person and put the knife in their side. There's evidence of an agent cause. And this person also had a motive. there was evidence of an end cause. You with me? Yeah? 3 types of causes. So a simple example of causes is a boiling kettle. Why did the kettle boil? Well, a natural cause is H2O, water molecules getting excited with heat energy, and they change from liquid to gas, physics type answer. It's natural causes, that's why the kettle boiled. A personal agent cause is that Mary turned the kettle on, or the jug on. End cause is Mary wanted a cup of tea. That's why the kettle boiled. You following me? Yeah? And so back to what I was saying earlier. A thoroughgoing naturalist, a thoroughgoing modernist, who says all there is matter and energy, does not accept any agent causes or end causes. Yeah? They just don't exist. Everything is just matter and energy. And you can only find out about that through application of the inductive scientific method to prove it happened with a very, very, very high degree of probability. That's the worldview that's going on there overall. And miracles, by definition, have an agent cause. There is an agent at work, the G word, God. A very pretty powerful agent at work. So it's really important to land that when you're looking at miracles, because that's very, very important overall. So how can you argue for miracles at all if you're just talking past each other? Yeah. Well, the important thing there is to understand that whole aspect of abductive reasoning. How you take evidence and say what best explains this evidence, which is exactly what a court of law does, and that's why I keep referring to that. It's exactly what an insurance company does when they're looking at a fire and they're trying to say what caused this fire. Was it natural cause? Or is there evidence of an agent cause at play? And somebody's deliberately said there's evidence of a can of petrol lying around. And also there's evidence of end cause, of motive, because the person who owned the building's in terrible financial trouble and they want the insurance. So they're looking for causes beyond just natural causes overall. And miracles, by definition, are things that are beyond natural causes. Yeah? So, and that abductive reasoning is basically saying you take all that evidence and what hypothesis will best explain it. Most explanatory power, the scope for all the facts that we've got, best explanatory scope, most plausible for all those facts, it's contradicted by the least facts, and is just not ad hoc overall. So the key thing we have to look at with miracles, in one way of looking at it, is what's the evidence? Or what is the evidence? And to what degree are we happy to accept certainty? And that's what I put up there. Now, I'm not 100% certain that my wife's vision of me talking in front of people as a Christian was a miracle, was a prophetic miracle. I'm highly certain it was. And the more highly certain events I see in my life, in my journey as a Christian, the more that confirms my belief in those type of miracles. Now, I'm actually a pretty skeptical individual. When somebody says, oh, so-and-so was healed, my first reaction is, yeah, okay. Yeah. But I know there's been healings in my life as a Christian over the last 13 years. Doctors, will put them down as unexplained. But there's a woman in our church in Whakaparoa whose daughter on the pre-scan, hole in the heart, kid's definitely going to die, lots of prayer, next scan, it's all gone. Well, that could be that the first scan had something wrong with it. So you can't actually 100% prove any of those type of miracles. But I think as you walk in Christian life and you see them, without being naive, you can see a lot of the evidence, what hypothesis fits best, or just coincidence after coincidence after coincidence, or an agent cause at play, intervening cause. So, when we look at miracles, we come on to what's the evidence, how does it come together? What hypothesis can be put forward to explain what we see? And we'll talk about the resurrection shortly in that way. Test the hypothesis. What hypothesis has got the most explanatory power, most explanatory scope, is the most plausible, least ever. Right. So, I've thrown a lot at you there. And some of your brains are about to explode. But hopefully now, by what I go through now, this will start to make sense as I apply some of what we just talked about, okay? So just go in. First, you go to the case against miracles. The arguments against miracles actually are pretty weak. The most famous is by David Hume, 1711 to 1776. David Hume was a radical empiricist. What that means is, really, all we can know. I'm not saying he was a materialist, but in terms of his epistemology, all we can know is through the empirical method. That's it. And actually that made him a practical materialist. I haven't done enough research on his views on reality. Some of his writings, he refers to God and stuff, so especially at that time. But in terms of his in saying what we can know, how do we know stuff? His view was we can only know it by empirical means, empirical evidence assessed in what we would now call a scientific method overall. And his argument basically is this, that a miracle is a violation of a law of nature. Experience is our only guide, and that uniform experience of the laws of nature is overwhelming. There's laws of nature and they don't get broken. Therefore, we must always reject miracles. That's his argument. It really is not a lot more than that. Uniform experience of the laws of nature trumps human testimony. Boom. End of story. It's just like, really? You're sort of just ruling it out. You're saying that the laws of nature operate uniformly, most of the time, virtually all of the time. Therefore, they operate all the time, and miracles can't exist. Now, if you're not feeling convinced by that, there's something wrong with that, well, you're right. What's wrong with that is it's basically just saying agent cause that interrupts the laws of nature, which is the very definition of a miracle, just can't exist. Go away. Sort of just ruling it out. It's sort of playing with the rules of the game, right? It's like saying, we're going to play a game of rugby, but there's only one try line. And the All Blacks have got that try line. Wales haven't got one. I'm sure you can think of better analogies than that, but it's just sort of, it's fiddling with the rules to rule it out in the first place, overall. There's two forms of Hume's argument, because, we haven't got David Hume here now. So we've got people now try and look at his work and try and work out what was he really saying. The hard form is where people will say, well, what Hume was saying is that actually miracles just can't happen. They ontologically can't happen. They can't be real. There's some who say that's what he was saying. Others say, no, it was an epistemic. He's really saying we just can't know if they've happened. There's a big difference if you think about it. One is saying we can't know it. The other is saying they just don't happen. But either way, you just rule out. And really, there's been no real improvement on the argument against miracles philosophically than that since then. They're just ruled out. Can't happen. But they're ruled out because their ontology and their epistemology, their worldview, just rules them out. Now, sometimes Christians are called narrow-minded, and often people would say we're free thinkers. Well, this is a very narrow view of reality and humanity. And so it's really just, that's the argument against miracles. That's it. Not a lot more. So miracles are basically what do people do then? When miracles happen, they're either rationalized away as natural events. There's got to be a natural cause. So, in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, a lot of work done by liberal theologians was, well, how do we work out how Jesus walked on water? Well, there must have been a cold period that hit the Sea of Galilee, and there was really ice, and he walked on ice. Or there was a sandbank that came across and then disappeared. You get these naturalistic explanations. We'll just explain it away naturally. Yeah, that's one. And so they're not really arguments, they're just naturalistic explanations. Other ones are miracles of myth. So often with the resurrection, for example, every Easter you'll get somebody turn up on TV who will say, there's a group of academics in the US called the Jesus Seminar, who their key argument is that it's all legend, made up hundreds of years after. Dan Brown, the Da Vinci Code, you know, very much similar. You know, it's all made up later. Now, is that true? What does the evidence say? We'll come back to that. Miracles are not empirically permissible. They're just not permissible. That's the sort of one we've just gone through with him. Then there's the more subjective postmodern interpretation. If they're true for you, they're true for you. If they're not true for you, it's not true for you. That's what it is. Because nothing's really real and nothing's really knowable anyway. It's just, it's true for you, it's true for you. Now actually that's logically impossible. They can't both be right. They either happened or they didn't. That's the problem with postmodernism. You know? It's just logically impossible. Either Jesus was risen from the dead or he wasn't risen from the dead. I suppose Paul's argument. You know, and if he, in 1 Corinthians 15. And if he wasn't risen from the dead, we're to be pitied. Don't believe it. I mean, Christianity is a historically verifiable, testable worldview. There's either facts fit it or they don't. And if the facts don't fit it, don't believe it. So you take Mormonism. To be a thoroughgoing Mormon, you've got to believe that Joseph Smith found some plates in North America. There were evidence of 20 tribes that had left Israel years before. The fact that there's no archaeological evidence whatsoever. That one of the documents turned up later, and they did, after the Rosetta Stone was found, they managed to translate it, and there was nothing that Joseph Smith said was on it. It's not verified. Same with Islam, actually. The text of the Quran has not got the textual evidence of the Christian Bible, the New Testament, to be tested against. So, miracles, postmodernism, great, it's great. You can believe that, you believe that. And then there's very similar, which is a different way of saying the same thing, is miracles are just subjective faith. The resurrection liturgy and event, it's just a wonderful story. Jesus is with us. Jesus is risen as a wonderful faith narrative at Easter. I'm sorry if I sound a bit dismissive. I don't want to believe a myth. I want to believe something because it's true. And if it ain't true, I don't want to just convince myself to believe it. In fact, you could say I'm a radical skeptic in some ways. I want evidence, but not just, I want evidence that fits with the human condition. The human condition of wonderful good in humanity and wonderful and amazing evil in humanity, that fits with our desires, that fits with our mind. So I'm not a narrow person who just says it's got to be science, whatever, that makes sense of love, that makes sense of beauty, that makes sense of art. I want evidence that fits all that, plus the science stuff, plus the historical stuff. The names of cities in the Bible, the times of things that all fit together, the archaeology, I want to believe something because it's true. So, that's the argument against miracles. Either it's argued that they're just impossible, largely, or you just can't know it, and then sort of post that, they're sort of explaining them away. Okay? So what is the evidence for miracles? Really there's two approaches you can take to argue for miracles. The top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. And you can actually come either way. The top-down approach is to present evidence for God. There is strong evidence for God, for an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good being who was the cause and designer of this universe, And once you've established that, well, a miracle is a piece of cake, isn't it? Yeah. You know, it's perfectly logical. If those propositions are true, God exists, God can break the laws of nature whenever he feels like, therefore miracles can happen. You know, sort of top-down view, which you can then match up with a bottom-up view. A bottom-up view says, well, when things that are claimed to be miracles happen, what's the evidence around it? The physical evidence. You know, I talked about a scan of a baby before, a scan of a baby later. The physical evidence, the eyewitness evidence, all of which could be more trustworthy or not. Yeah? But what is the bottom-up evidence around a particular miracle that you can assess to say, is this trustworthy? It doesn't have to be 100%, because you can always come up with some other theory. You know? So top down, bottom up, and I'll just quickly race through. How are we doing time-wise, Andrew?
Yeah, 5-10 minutes.
Okay. So very quickly race through it. Just the top down view. Top down view, argument for God. Now I'm not going to go through this because this will be a subject of a whole other talk, but very, very quickly. For me, you know, the case for God is huge. It is unbelievable. I think it takes more faith to not believe in God. And I don't think I'm biased with that. You know? For me, there's three sources of believing that. There's the evidence for cause and designing in the universe. Yeah? There's the evidence of real, objective, moral goodness. That there are these things that are good or bad, good or evil, just or unjust, fair or unfair, that's real. You know, if all people disagree with it, it's not just opinion, it's not just made up by society. And the evidence from beauty, from these things that are not physical, but are real as well. And you know, I could do an hour-long, 45-minute thing on that, but you take the evidence of cause and design, and it's actually very similar to some of the things I talked about earlier. You know, there are three types of cause: natural cause, agent cause, final cause. Example of boiling jug, we touched on that. Look at the universe. The scientific evidence says the universe had a start. The philosophical evidence says the universe had a start. It's generally accepted. People keep on trying to squeeze out of that, because as Fred Hoyle, an atheistic physicist, said in about, I think it was the 1930s or 40s, it's repugnant to believe there was a start of the universe. When he said the word repugnant, he meant to his philosophical ideas. You know, when Einstein first did his theory of relativity and it pointed to a start, he put a constant in there. Because we can't have a start. Hubble, and the expansion of the universe, various other things being proven, I'm not going to go through all that. Generally accepted that there was a start of the universe. Yeah? And if there's a start, there was a cause. But there wasn't anything, there was no matter, energy, or time. Matter, energy, and time came into existence. So it's either just so, or the cause is a non-material, all-powerful being that's got free will that caused the universe to exist. Sounds a bit like God. Yeah. So there's strong evidence of cause to the universe. There's strong evidence of the fine-tuning of the universe. Everything's just shown, the initial conditions of the universe. Won't go through all that. It'll be a subject of another talk, I'm sure. But this universe is just right for life to exist. It was slightly different. Statistically, physicists, cosmologists have no problem talking about this. In fact, I was talking with George earlier, mathematicians, physicists, cosmologists, very often are theists. Because the evidence seems to point to that. It's biologists who often seem to have the problem, because they've got a doctorate. and so, the fine-tuning of the universe. In the area of biology, DNA. DNA seems to have all the attributes of coded information. Coded information, the only source of very specific coded information we know, you go back to Hume's uniformity arguments, if you apply that to this, you'd say the only cause of coded information we know is a mind. It points to a mind. Since the 50s, the discovery of DNA. And these aren't slam dunk. None of these are 100%ers, overall. You come back to that certainty. It's cumulative. Then there's systems. The overall neo-Darwinian thesis is everything came about from inert matter and energy with gradual small changes over a very long time. Everything. So there has to be gradual small changes that come through. Now, a lot of physical evidence doesn't support that, in geology, etc. There is a lot of evidence to support some change over time, a lot. We have to acknowledge that. But some systems, you look at, you've got to work hard to see how they came about. The best explanation how we got lungs, it was a fish bladder that suddenly became a lung over time. Now, there's some really imaginative speculations to how that happens. And they're called science, although they're not in a scientific method, in a way. But, just a butterfly. I'm not going to go through all this, but the irreducible complexity that's there in systems, could they have come about gradually? Put all that together, there is powerful evidence for cause and designing evidence in this universe. Very, very powerful. Top-down argument. Goodness. Virtues, values. Where did they come from? Does society, are they social constructs out of nowhere? Or just does society decide, or are they real? A bit like mathematics. They're real, abstract things that are there to be discovered. But if there are real laws, real oughts, there must have been a lawgiver. It was all good. Very powerful. Because I think deep down intuitively, I put human intuitions there, we know there is fair, something's a fair or unfair, just or unjust. It's deep knowledge in humanity that. Theologically, Christianity explains that. The image of God and conscience. The only answer in a full neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory is it's just evolved, because it works. Well, if Hitler had won the war and he worked, might would make right. But, if somebody came along that won the argument, the number of people say torturing babies for fun is okay, that makes it right. That's the basic argument there. But we all deep down, this is evidence. I would be prepared to argue this. The value of human life. If somebody says a dolphin's life is worth more than a little baby's, they're sick. It's basic intuitive knowledge. We know the value of human life. For humans to kill humans, the only thing you've got to do is dehumanize them. So we label them. Jews, black, gay, Croatian. Now we can kill them. Because they're not human. But you can't kill humans. You take Nazi Germany, they still hung murderers. Because you couldn't kill humans. Whilst they were gassing millions of Jews and gypsies. You've got to dehumanize to kill humans. So, and then beauty, the soul, I had an out-of-body experience when I was crushed underground. That was real. Say that to a thorough naturalist, and they go, oh yeah, you felt it, the chemicals made you feel that. No, I was floating above my body as I was being crushed. Very calm, knew what was going on. That's powerful evidence to me. Some of these evidences are harder to convince others. Abstract Buddha, we touched on that. Peacock, lots of things you could talk about. Music, dance. What's that all about? Is it just social conventions? Was there something deeper here? Real touches the soul? Music, language, maths. Wales going to try against England. It's a real beauty. Love. Is that just chemicals? Sacrificial love? Yeah. So there's a lot top-down to argue for theism. I think we've got great arguments. And in the world of philosophy, it's winning. Theistic philosophy is amongst the fastest growing philosophical movement around now. It's growing. Hugely. Because atheism has poor answers to so many of the basic things in this world. So, top down, so if there's a lot of arguments for God, well, a miracle's a piece of cake, isn't it? Slam dunk. It's not 100%, though. It's cumulative. So, one case for miracles is a top-down case. Bottom up is to say, well, what's evidence? You take both types of miracle, both the bottom up, the improbable events, and the bottom up, the natural events. There's two classic ones in it from a Christian perspective. Firstly, bottom up prophecy. Prophecy is about Christ coming, biblical prophecy. there's amazing prophecies in the Bible about the coming of Christ. Now, the number here given is 300. If you actually look at some of those 300 that are quoted by some people who write about it, they're pretty weak. You've got to stretch your imagination. I think they do themselves a disservice by using weak ones at times. But there are a lot about the timing of his coming. Daniel, the timing from the time of writing takes it almost exactly as far as we can know to the time of Christ coming. The 770s. It's incredible. It's the time of his birth, his forerunner, his nature, his ministry, his death, resurrection, later events. And in the interest of time, I won't go through all these, but Jeremiah 23:5, Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, Psalm 22, and I mentioned Daniel there as well. Is that a slam dunk? No. But boy, it's pretty hard to explain away. Was it just lucky overall? And there's lots of other biblical prophecy. The prophecy around the city of Tyre and what would happen to it. That it would be flattened, it would be put out into the sea. This city was flattened. They were basically sieged. While they were sieged, they moved the city out to an island offshore to survive. The prophecy is that the city of the then would be destroyed. It was. The prophecy was that it would be thrown out into the sea. Later, I think it was Alexander, later then built a causeway to attack it, and then thoroughly destroyed the other city. And the prophecy was it would never get rebuilt. Now, they are very specific prophecies about something that would be pretty hard to predict. Not impossible to predict and strike lucky. But so prophecy in the Bible, I think, is one example. And the type of things that happen that many in the world Christians could relate. I think of good bottom-up examples of highly improbable things that can happen. And then the resurrection. The resurrection is a classic of abductive reasoning, from the facts. And I talked on the resurrection for 40 minutes a while ago. But, it is the ultimate miracle. Our faith as Christians is based on that the resurrection happened. Paul, as I said, makes that absolutely clear. And the logic applied to that is abductive reasoning. The same reasoning that you apply in any past event. Basically says, what are the facts that we've got? What's the evidential facts? And what explains those facts? What hypothesis has got the most expounding power? And there are a basic number of historical facts that actually allow you to dismiss many other theories. Jesus genuinely existed. www.jesusdidn'texist.com is not historically reliable. These are historical facts from non-Christian historians, applying good historical method. Jesus genuinely existed. He was crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate. We know Pontius Pilate existed, although many argued in the early 1900s he didn't, because we've since found strong archaeological evidence to support that. Under the reign of Pontius Pilate, his body disappeared and never was found. Generally accepted again, both external evidence and not. No external evidence argues it didn't. Jewish writings of that time doesn't dispute that. They just come up with other theories about what happened to the body. The body genuinely disappeared. The tomb was empty. His followers, right from the beginning, genuinely believed they'd seen the risen Christ. When I say right from the beginning, often people who come up with legend theories will say, it was all written 100 years later, whatever. They try to argue from the Gospels. They try and give very late dating of the Gospels. They never deal with Paul's writings. 1 Corinthians, we know exactly when 1 Corinthians was written. It was written in about AD 54. We know that because it refers to Gallio in Acts. Gallio, we know the exact date when Gallio, actually interestingly, the title given to Gallio, again, a lot of skeptical scholars back in the early 1900s said it must have been made up, the title, because that title didn't exist in the Roman world. They've since found archaeological evidence that named Gallio, that also a letter from a Roman emperor that said exactly what his role was and what he did. So we've got evidence that supports that. Written in AD 54, it contains a creed in 1 Corinthians 15. That creed was passed on to him most historians who've looked at this, Christian or not, and Jewish especially, there's a number of Jewish historians who've looked at this area as well, would say it dates back to within 4 or 5 years of the actual crucifixion of Christ. It's not a legend. His followers genuinely believe that it's seen the risen Christ. And later followers, Paul and James, came to believe that as well. And his followers worshipped him right from the beginning. And they were Jews, and they worshipped him. You take all those facts, what hypothesis explains those facts? As the most expansive power. He swooned and came alive later. Just doesn't, they're not going to worship someone like that. They're not going to die for someone like that. So that just doesn't stack up with the objective reasoning in a court of law. What's most highly likely to prove it? His twin brother suddenly popped up. Well, seriously, somebody got a PhD for that in California. I am not kidding. I am not kidding. That was the theory. His twin brother. And James said, "Oh, hi, Jesus. I didn't believe you when you were alive, but I'll believe you now." Wouldn't he go, hey, Jesus, you remember when we were kids and we used to muck around with our dad with the nails and all that? And he'd say, yeah, we did that. Ah, gotcha. We didn't do that. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Legend theory just doesn't stack up because historically the evidence doesn't support that at all. The other one then is hallucination theory. There was hallucination. They believed, yes, they'd seen it, but they hallucinated. There's no evidence of mass hallucinations like that. Hallucinations tend to be singular events and certainly not of a bodily nature, which they clearly were overall. So you run through these hypotheses, which is about what is the most explanatory scope, explanatory power. It's actually only that the resurrection is true. Now, is that 100% certain? No. Reasonable doubt? I think it's a high level of evidence, very high, for a miracle, a profound miracle that's changed the world and changed its followers. So, top down, bottom up, lots of two ways of approaching it. So, wrap it up. What's a miracle? Two types of miracle. A highly improbable events type. I think we see those regularly, actually, although I think we need to be cautious. Otherwise, we are susceptible to charlatans, and the enemy can work through that. Ouija boards, those sort of things. Are they miracles? Highly probable. I think there's something going on there. I'm pretty convinced of that, but it's not from God. And then the actual breaking of natural laws. I think they're quite rare, overall. But when you take some of those, how do they stack up on the evidence? Ontology and epistemology, I hope I didn't lose you there, because that's really important. What is the nature of reality and how do we know things? That's all it is. Long words, but that's all it's about. And very often the arguments against miracles come from an ontology, an epistemology that says, all there is matter and energy, miracles can't happen. I think that's pretty close-minded. It's not following the evidence where it leads. It's not assessing the evidence. It would be a bit like, literally, if you apply that logic, we wouldn't convict anyone in our courts of law. We really wouldn't. Because you couldn't prove it to the level they talked about. Well, and secondly, actually, and this is the ridiculousness. Secondly, somebody could argue that they haven't got free will, they're just chemicals, and their DNA and their chemicals made them do it. When these philosophies first come out in America, 2 murderers got off because of that argument in Chicago. It was not their will, and they got away with it. But this is the logical extension of these ideas. We really take them forward. So, case against miracles largely comes from a rule them out before we even start approach. They're just not admissible in that ontology and that epistemology. The case 4, I think there's 2 cases, top-down approach, prove God, piece of cake. Miracles happen. And that's why I think as Christians we're pretty accepting of that. Because it just seems, well, no big deal. I think sometimes we can be too accepting. I would advocate a evidence-based caution, because that can leave us susceptible to charlatans, as I say. You know? And then on the bottom up, well, the evidence the other way. I think the evidence the other way on types of miracles that are highly improbable. You know, people, if you're not, even if you try to be ultra skeptical, it's very hard to deny a lot of things. Because God coincidences add up. Yeah. And I put myself on this, the ultra skeptical to naive. I'm more down that end personally. I like to know things. Does that work out? Yeah. And then the bottom up from natural events can be more difficult. We're dealing with historical evidence. But if that historical evidence was completely against, like Mormonism, historical evidence for Mormonism does not exist. Well, Christianity would have a pretty weak base, a very weak base. So it is important. It shouldn't be just dismissed. And more the archaeological, historical evidence that's found continually reinforces and supports Scripture. It's quite uncanny. Things that people got PhDs for, they don't. I wish they should have to recant and give their PhD back up. But perhaps that's unfair because they're only dealing with the evidence they got. But a lot of that stuff written in the early 1900s in particular, when there was a radical skepticism at play. Well, Bethlehem didn't exist because we haven't got any evidence that exists. And then they find evidence for Bethlehem. They find stones with, the name of David on them, things like that. The evidence continuously in the last 100 years is supportive of the truth of Scripture and the Christian worldview. So top down, bottom up. So finally, in conclusion, I think we've got good reasons to believe in miracles. I think we should not be ashamed of saying we believe in miracles. It's not just some naive view. I think it's evidentially supported overall, and we should feel comfortable with that overall. I think the arguments against actually are pretty weak. They are a play with the rules to rule it out. They're not engaged with the evidence to see where the evidence leads and what best explains the evidence largely. They're quite dismissive usually. So that's me finished. Thank you very much. And any time for questions, Andrew?
Yeah, you have 10 minutes or so.
Okay. Okay, we'll just take some questions. Take a minute just to talk to the person next to you, just to relax a bit. Talk to the person next to you, come up with a question, and then we'll take some questions. I'll just talk to you. Okay, I just want to give you enough time to switch from receiving to transmitting. So, who's got first question?
Richard Dawkins.
Yep.
So many people quote him as being the definitive source for science, but just the little that I've heard of him, he seems to be so anti-God that he becomes anti-science as well. I mean, there's some of the things he says are not scientific. and he sounds
Yeah,
like
he's an interesting character, Richard Dawkins. Well, there's a lot of evidence that he's a bit of an embarrassment to philosophers. My daughter did philosophy in Auckland. And Auckland's had a history of a strong atheistic view in the philosophy department. I don't think it is so much now. But with, what's the name, Bradley, was it David Bradley? Strong atheist, from a very strong Christian family. His brother attends Volpro Baptist, Neville Parish. And my daughter attended there, and she remembers one lecture she had where the lecturer, so he just, somebody brought up Richard Dawkins, and he just complete embarrassment and a joke, you know, because his philosophical arguments are very weak and you know, very dated actually, you know, overall. I did an essay, 2 essays I did, on his book, The Case for Evolution. That's the subtext. The top line is something. Oh gosh. No.
About the blind watchmaker?
No, the one after the blind watchmaker. You did one after that, and it's called The Case for Evolution anyway. And when you approach a book like that, you sort of think, you know, and the Biola, when I'm doing my apologetics masters, what you tend to do is read anti-stuff before you ever get to a Christian view of it, which is good, you know. And you get at the end and you think there's nothing here. You know, it really isn't much here. And there's something deeper going on with that guy. Clearly, a more emotional reaction to religion. You know, he's a strong neo-Darwinian. He doesn't like anyone who disagrees with him, even if they're scientists. He won't accept any other point of view, and so he's a fundamentalist. And fundamentalists aren't pleasant. You know, in any fundamentalist, Christians, and I'm not talking about Christians in the 1920s who signed a document called the Fundamentals, which I would sign with a microsecond actually, because it's the orthodoxies of the faith. But that's sort of nasty fundamentalists, fundamentalist Islam, fundamentalist Christian. It's where there's a hate that throws out of anyone who disagrees. And so I don't really know what's going on with him there. I'm not sure if he's anti-science. He's certainly a radical materialist, which actually makes him really difficult for him, because part of his argument is that Christianity is the cause of evil in the world, and yet on his worldview there's no such thing as evil. And he actually writes that in some places. It's just a construct, it doesn't really exist.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things I'm saying, not that he's anti-science, but the things that he says in favour of science are actually not scientific.
Well, he goes way beyond where he starts. The scientific method has been wonderful at helping us understand nature. But it is bounded largely, and this is where the argument on is there evidence for design kicks in, and is that scientific? Is, you know, the argument is the scientific method, methodological naturalism, is great at finding natural causes. Okay? The question is, should it be limited to inferring natural causes, which is the abductive method? So, if the evidence of science suggests there's strong evidence of fine-tuning, or that there's strong evidence of information there, has it got to deny there can be anything other than a natural explanation? Now, I'm okay with them saying, look, it's hard to get a natural explanation here, but we're going to keep working at it. But that's different to saying there cannot be an agent explanation. Yeah. And so he goes to that step. You know? And yet, when pushed, you know, and I've seen him in debate with John Lennox, when pushed, because when you take him right back and say, well, what was the origin, the cause of the first cell, which is a major problem for evolution, because the first cell, even in the most simple side, is incredibly complex overall. So that, you know, how you got that is a major problem in origin science, as it's called. He sort of leaves a little gap that, well, something could have happened. You know, when he's pushed, I don't know. He's an interesting character, but he goes way beyond the bounds of his arguments. There's a lot of theology in his arguments. The same as in Origin of Species. There's a lot of theology. And the main argument in the Origin of Species was a very bright man that was Darwin was saying. One of his main arguments was suffering and evil in the world. And part of the argument was, let's distance God from the world so God can't be responsible for that. So there's been a natural mechanism that's out work. You can't blame God now for all the natural suffering. There's a lot of that going on there. There's a lot of theology in Origin of Species. There's a lot of theology in in Dawkins' book, A Case for Evolution. You know, for example, the argument about bad design. Well, God wouldn't have designed it that way. Well, that's theological. It's nothing to do with science. You know, God could design something any way he likes. You know, perhaps God just had fun. You know, perhaps he liked the beauty of it. So it's interesting. He goes way beyond the bounds of what he can do. Sorry.
Could you put up Hume's case again? I'd like to relate it to the hole in the heart case that you mentioned. It's the fourth point where Hume draws a conclusion. We must always reject the possibility of a miracle. If you put, therefore, we must always be skeptical about so-called miracles, that would, to me, that would be acceptable. If we think about this in relation...
I would possibly prefer we shouldn't be naive.
Pardon?
Subtle difference, but we shouldn't be naive.
We shouldn't be naive, yeah. The hole in the heart that you were discussing, if you could put a monitor on that heart between the first picture showing the hole and the latter picture showing it fixed, and then monitor that progress, it could have been the case that some healing mechanism already built into the architecture of the cells in the heart could have kicked in and healed, covered up that hole. And there you have a natural explanation. We can't rule that out.
Yeah, I agree.
Also, we should give thanks as believers that God designed something like that to heal itself.
Okay.
Just like if I cut myself, later that wound would heal up.
I'd agree. You know, and that's what I'm saying is, to me, there's a highly improbable event. Could it be a miracle? Couldn't it? Hold that lightly. I suppose when you walk as a Christian and you see a lot of improbable events, even when you're reasonably skeptical, it does reinforce your belief that something's going on.
But it's not an improbable event that the heart has covered up a hole, because we see it almost weekly in the cuts that we...
Well, look, we'd have to get into the medicine of that. The way it was related to me is that was it was improbable, but I'll accept that. You know, blood clotting itself is a miracle, isn't it? You could argue.
I would say no.
Yeah, but blood clotting is amazing. Perhaps amazing is a better word.
Amazing, yes, miracle.
Yeah, perhaps amazing is a better word than miracle. Yeah. You know, and you're right, and that's where we have to not overreach as well, and not be naive. And not
it could have been the case that Hume was reacting to a culture around him where naive people were always mentioning miracles.
And that's part of the thing. I've got some sympathy with the Richard Dawkins of this world. Is they don't want to allow any foothold. As soon as you admit you could infer an agent cause, to them the whole world of science collapses. Now I don't believe that's true, but that's their fear, and you can have some sympathy with that fear. And you're right about historical context. Like I was saying about Darwin, historical context of Anglican natural theology at that time, in fact, in many ways opened the door for a lot of things. There's always context and there's always pendulums going on, reaction and overreaction. So it's good.
Yeah, I think the book you're thinking about was Evolution, the Greatest Show on Earth.
That's it, Greatest Show on Earth.
And there is Jonathan Safarti's reply to that, which is Evolution, the Greatest Hoax on Earth, which basically goes line by line through his book, and one of them being with the design of the eye, where Dawkins gives his opinion, and then Jonathan Safarti quotes an ophthalmologist or eye expert who says, well, actually the design is designed the way it is because of, and gives the reasoning behind how it actually works.
Yeah, it is the greatest show on earth, you're right. Other questions? Okay, what's one?
What's the best miracle you've heard of?
Resurrection.
In modern times. Like
well,
personally.
Look, when you hear of miracles, second hand, third hand, you know, I can't help but, you know, a little bit like a gentleman here, you sort of think, not sure. You hear a lot of miracles claimed. I don't believe they're all charlatans, and I don't believe they're all made up. Right? I haven't looked at miracles in that sense. In some ways, the ones closest to you is what you can relate to and what you've seen.
So which is the best one?
So for me, it was serving as an associate pastor of Auckland Baptist part-time, and there was constant prophetic words that were coming from people that, we had, you know, we'll go into details, but we had something going on there, etc. at our church. And this isn't just us, we weren't just looking for stuff. You know, and this wasn't one thing in 10. It was a series of 80% of what was coming through from different people who couldn't know each other. It's not as big as I said, it's Windsor Park, but it's a bit like Windsor Park in that there's loads of people who don't know each other, because it's a relatively big Baptist church. And you just look at that and you go, I think God's trying to tell us something. You know, and so there's that, there's my wife's, you know, and a lot of people look at it again, you can come up with theories, you can say it's wishful thinking. I know the context of that time and my wife does. That context, it wasn't even on the agenda that I would ever become a Christian. It was in there. And so we can come up with explanations to explain away. And I say it's you're not going to get 100%.
So is your greatest miracle that you are here as a Christian?
Probably, yeah. You know, but it's not a miracle. You come back to that. I mean, I think I could, relate a lot of things about, that word miracle. You do come back to. And this is where you've got to take Hume. Hume was a very radical empiricist. He would deny our ability to know most things you would take as known, never mind miracles. So it comes back to at what point are you willing to say, I believe this and know it? And I don't think you can live life wanting to have everything 100% certain. You cumulatively take things and say, what is the most probable explanation? And when I look at explanations of this world, the human condition, life, the Christian theistic worldview is incredible explanatory power of virtually everything. Materialistic physicalism doesn't even get near. Things like human consciousness, the mind, it doesn't get anywhere near it. Postmodernism is plain nonsense. There are things that are true. There are things that are knowable. And so you look around, and this is why we should have a very confident faith, a gracious faith, because the evidence, Christianity's got huge, strong evidence to support it, but we shouldn't overreach like Dawkins does. We shouldn't, if my response to that question was, no, it was a miracle. That hole healed. Sorry, you heretic, you've got to believe. Well, that would just be inauthentic and ridiculous. Of course it could have been natural. Was it likely, etc.? You'd have to go back and dig into it. And that's what Dawkins does. He overreaches. And we shouldn't overreach. But we can be confident in the reasons we believe. So wrapping that up and finishing, because it's quite a good segue, there's a conference next week called Confident Christianity. You can tell I'm a sales guy as well. There isn't a buy one get one free with it, but it's at Northcote Baptist. It's Friday night and Saturday. It's got a lot of great speakers. It's got a few poor ones like me, but it's got some really great ones. A guy called Brett Kunkel, who's over from the States. He's with an organisation over there called Stand to Reason. Very good, engaging speaker. He's there. But there's also a lot of New Zealand speakers. I think Neil Broom's speaking, who's also coming along here later. Anybody else comes to mind? Zachary Arden from Auckland, doing his PhD in biology. Evolution. He's speaking. So I'd recommend you. Northcote Baptist is not far away. It starts Friday evening, and Friday evening is free. The Saturday is a paid event. We've got a lot of registrations already, a lot of different speakers on different topics. So if you're interested in this type of stuff, and this type of stuff, I always often say it's only about 5 to 10% of any church that really finds this interesting. You add that up and it adds up in a lot of Christians, and that's why a ministry like Andrew and George have pioneered here is fantastic. Thinking Matters is an organisation that's trying to connect a lot of people with interest in this area. What are the reasons we believe, why do we believe what we believe across New Zealand overall. Doing it in a very gracious way that adds some broadness, because you get people who in this area, they can often start arguing. You take that whole area of cause and design. I didn't say to you how I think that's been worked out. I didn't say to you that I believe it was 6 days, or whether it was 15 billion years, or whether it was worked out through evolution. Those are all the hows of how that could have been worked out. It can get very divisive between Christians, unnecessarily so. I have an opinion, but I don't hold it at the same level. The opinion of cause and design, I hold it a 9, 10, or a 10. The evidence is really strong. How it was worked out, to me, I hold it at a lower level of certainty overall. And try and result. And so, Thinking Matters is trying to bring together people in this area who can be gracious, who can can speak well, who can talk to the evidence. There'll be some breadth of opinions. That's good overall. And so it's an organisation that's highly supportive of what Andrew's doing here as well, and linked. And I'd encourage you to go along this Friday, Saturday if you can. Thanks a lot.